And joining us now is Arturo Lopez-Levy. He's an assistant professor of international relations and politics at Holy Names University in California. Thank you very much for your time. Now, tell us, how did we get to this point? Why have the protests turned so violent?
Well, the protests are the result of a government of dubious legitimacy. The problem is that Dina Butarte, the current president, was the vice president under Pedro Castillo, a president that himself was elected by a group of circumstances in which the traditional parties were unable to channel the different views of the population. Mr. Castillo ran the country for a year and a half, more or less, from July 2021 to December 7, 2022, but his government was a real mess. He didn't have a lot of support in Congress, and he and Mrs. Boluarte had broke ranks with the party that proposed them as candidates for president and vice president. So Mr. Castillo tried to dissolve Congress. Congress retaliated by impeaching Mr. Castillo, and Mrs. Boluarte became the first woman president of Peru. Originally, people assumed that Mr. Castillo will not be able to rally a lot of people on his support, but because of the racial, ethnic divide, regional divide between rural and urban, eventually the supporters of Castillo's, and mainly those who are very dissatisfied with the coalition with the right wing that Mrs. Boluarte tried to prepare, they launched the protests. The protests at the beginning were controlled and focused on a particular or concentrated in a particular area in southern Peru, but later it has become more spread. So,
There have been calls for
basically the main problem, that there is an economy that is not doing very well, a president with a very shake sources of legitimacy, and that's the situation. And there is a demand for early elections.
Okay. Before we get to that, just if you can just tell me a little bit about how and why it's become so violent. 42 people have been killed. There are calls for an investigation into allegations of excessive force by security forces. How did it get to be so deadly?
Well, there is a history of political violence in Peru that it's already present, and a political culture in the Andean regions that it's very based on the idea of turning the corrupt or unjust order in the perception of actors in the Andean region upside down. So basically what we have is that since 1980 until more or less 1994, there were a very important guerrilla war, and actors were very familiar with the repertoire of using violence, using dynamite, and on the armed forces to go there and try to impose order at all costs, sometimes with gross violations of human rights.
And
I think this is part of the issue. This repertoire that is there, and the actors use it in order to promote their political agendas.
So are people able to live their lives, go to school, go to work? And, you know, what kind of calm can be expected? Of course, Mr. Castillo's supporters have been demanding new elections and calling for Ms. Boluarte's removal. But is she going to step down? And how likely can calm come about in Peru right now?
I think that, Sally, that big problem here is what role international actors can play, because you need a lot of mediation. I think that unfortunately, President Boluarte is trying to govern with a kind of mandate to and support mainly with right-wing parties, and she doesn't have the political space to do that. She has to create a government that its main responsibility will be to get into the next elections and see if with some reforms, because there is a lot of dystrophia in the political system in Peru, if with some reforms eventually you can have more healthy relations between Congress and the president.
Yeah.
The political system, Sally, is very fragmented, and without some support, something that is difficult because the region is split about the actions of President Boullarte. I think that it will be very hard not to see her going eventually or more violence.